GearNetwork.com.
The following is a presentation of the Gear Radio Network. You're listening to the Better Live Than Dead podcast on the Gear Radio Network.
And with that, we welcome you to a very special edition of the Better Live Than Dead podcast, powered by Better Live Than Dead and the Gear Radio Network. This is episode number 175, a chat with Jeff Dahlberg talking about a very new book that just came out a couple months ago. But first, before we get started, you can hear us on betterlivethanddead.com, gearnetwork.com, and wherever else you listen to podcasts. I am Ryan Wolfe at Wolfe BLTD. Joining me on the IndyCar Media Hotline, our guest, Jeff. How are you doing this evening?
Good, Ryan. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. I appreciate you. We've been going back and forth, I would say, for a couple of weeks now to try to get this together. I'm very glad that we're able to join each other on the podcast and have a quick little chat. Now, your book entitled "We All Just Bought a Team: The Biggest What-Ifs in Buffalo Sports History," available on Amazon.com. I've had the chance to check it out. I think these kind of concepts, for me personally, I eat them up. I would sit there all day. I'm the kind of guy that I'll go look at stats and I'm like, oh man, if, player X didn't miss, 25 games that season, he might have ended up scoring, X amount of goals, and then extrapolate that and I'll lose hours of my life on that stuff. So for me, this book, the book that you have, the concept that you have championed with this book, I find absolutely fantastic.
Well, thank you. And, I originally started the book was, there was a book by Mike Pesca came out a couple of years ago, called Upon Further Review, The Greatest What-Ifs in Sports History. And I bought the book thinking that there was going to be some Buffalo sports what-ifs. I thought at least they'll have no goal in there. Why write a little something? And, there were 37 chapters in the book and there wasn't one Buffalo sports what-if. And so I said to myself, this is a little strange because, we have some of the most famous sports what-ifs, of any community, of any fan base that I can think of. And so I decided, well, I will have to write it myself. And so that's how the book came about, basically.
So my question for you, obviously you mentioned, I know you live in Buffalo, but my question for you is, how long have you been a Buffalo sports fan? And for me, my favorite thing to ask people when it comes to talking about sports are, what are your most fondest memories of the Buffalo sports scene?
Well, how long have I been a Buffalo sports fan? I guess I would say basically my entire life. I'm not going to give out my age, but let's just say that I was a kid in the early 90s in the Jim Kelly era, and they went to the 4 Super Bowls. But I was a fan before that. I remember when I was very young, when Kelly was the first quarterback of the Bills. That was one of my first memories of being a Bills fan and all the excitement that was in town, that we had a new quarterback. And, I was kind of almost too young to understand, but I just knew there was something special happening with the Bills. I would say I was a Sabres fan at least as long as that, if not more, because I remember when I was going to games at the Odd with my father and, and that whole thing. So I guess probably I'd say most of my life, as long as I can be able to walk and talk, I've been a Buffalo sports fan.
So I think the nice thing for you, I know you said you don't want to mention your age, and I totally understand that because I'm getting to that point in my life where I'm like, don't ask. I'm not going to tell you. But I've spent up to, it's been documented on the podcast up until relatively recently, being a Bills fan for me has been nothing but watching terrible teams. I never was able to. I was way too young to remember any of that 90s run that the Buffalo Bills had. So, I remember, I always tell people my favorite story about the Bills is the first game I remember watching is the Music City Miracle. So it kind of set expectations real early for me, where it's like, that's another good what if, and that's kind of, like I said, when I started when I checked your book out, for me personally, it's fantastic because it kind of, you can lend a little bit to the imagination where you can kind of run with it and have a lot of fun with it, but you can also keep it grounded where it's like, well, what if, something happened and you're like, well, I'd be a millionaire. It's like, is that obvious? Is that possible? Like how legit is that? So it's nice you can kind of, like I said, keep it kind of rooted in reality, because we obviously know how things have played out, but also you can kind of have some fun with it. And again, that's really what I enjoyed about this book is it's just, it really is a page turner. I mean, you don't want to stop reading because you're like, okay, because then you read I read what you say, and then I'm like, okay, well, what do I think happened, or okay, he thinks that could have happened. Well, maybe on top of that, what if this other thing happens? Like, I know one of the things you mentioned in your book is the what if Buffalo had a Major League Baseball team, and we know back, I don't know, obviously I know that you know, but back in I think it was the early to mid '60s when the Expos first got their team, that Buffalo was a potential location for a Major League Baseball team. And now obviously with the pandemic, with COVID, we've seen that Buffalo can host a Major League Baseball team. They don't necessarily have the facilities for a long-term thing, but looking back at that, that's a really fun thing to just sit back and say, you know what? It would be really cool if the New York Yankees or the Boston Red Sox rolled into town, every couple weeks, and we got to witness that in Buffalo. Kind of like what we see with the Bills and what we see with the Sabres, where you're like, Alexander Ovechkin rolling into I almost said the HSBC Arena, the KeyBank Center. And it's just really cool to be able to witness that stuff. So it kind of gives you that ability to sit back and say, this is really, really cool. And all the interesting things we would have been able to witness, and all the great players we would have been able to see roll through Buffalo, if only that what if had come true.
Well, I mean, and that's true. And just last summer, because of COVID, the Blue Jays decided to have their games in Buffalo, and it was the first time that the city had major league games in, I would say, 1915 with the Federal League. So it was, it was something that was long overdue, I thought, and it did a lot for the city's image. I think to see, a warm, sunny day, the people playing baseball, and unfortunately, people in many other parts of the country think that somehow this area is like an Arctic tundra where, we don't have spring or summer, there's only one season, winter. And so I thought that that opportunity did a lot to dispel that myth that this area, isn't a four-season destination. It actually is. It's unfortunate that the city hasn't been able to make it with baseball in Major League Baseball. I guess because some of the people that I talked to thought that the economics of the modern-day MLB would rule it out. They were pointing out that other cities like Kansas City and San Diego and even Pittsburgh have trouble recruiting good players because, they want to go to the big money, big market teams. And, Buffalo would have run into the same problem. But it would be nice to think that, maybe if things had been different and the city had a Major League Baseball team, what would they have done for the city's image, in the national media?
And even looking at on that same page, looking at like Buffalo having an NBA team back, because obviously the Los Angeles Clippers were here. Same with Rochester, with the Rochester Royals. There were professional basketball teams in the area. In the grand scheme of things, was it a while ago to you and I? Yeah. But in the grand scheme of, I guess, time as just a flat circle, you look at it and you go, that was 60, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, not even. So it's like, it's possible. And seeing that the Pegulas have the Bills, they have the Sabres, they have the arena, they have Harbor Center. You wonder, I know that with the NBA expanding here relatively soon, that Seattle will likely be getting a team. That's pretty much all but a guarantee at this point. I really wonder if maybe we start to hear some rumblings about Buffalo sniffing around to potentially because obviously the economic side of things, the amount of money for an expansion franchise, all that stuff. I get that it's not financially, fiscally possible for the Pegulas to bring an NBA team to Buffalo right now or in the future. But it would be nice to even just have like that what if, like exactly like your book, where we could sit back and say, oh man, there's rumblings that, the Pegulas or someone else in Buffalo who has a lot of money that wants to have a basketball team in Buffalo. They're doing their due diligence, and that would be really cool. It's kind of like the same thing with the MLS too, where we talk about, there's a potential that the Bills could build a brand new stadium in downtown. And you say to yourself, well, if there's a brand new stadium, maybe the MLS comes. And again, these are all these opportunities where 30, 40 years down the road, if it does happen or if it doesn't happen, you can kind of continue to go back to that what if and say, well, hey, what if the MLS showed up, or what if they were able to bring an expansion team? And again, like I said, this topic for me is, it's one of those things that really like scratches at my brain and just kind of gives you that, like, you got that itch on your back, you can't get rid of it. And then you finally scratch the itch and you're like, oh man, that was fantastic. That's what your book and the topic of like what if does for me, which is why I was so excited to chat with you about this, because again, the opportunities are endless. You could do this for days, months, weeks. I could get lost in just what if.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up about the Buffalo Braves, because the same year that the Buffalo Braves got in the NBA, there were two other franchises, the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Portland Trail Blazers. And more than 50 years later, those two teams are still in the NBA. So, I mean, LeBron James played for the Cleveland Cavaliers before going to LA. It's something to think about, is what if the Braves had been still around and had been a winning team, could he have come here? I mean,
Absolutely.
I didn't include that in the chapter. I basically covered the story of the Braves in the 1970s and why they left and why things didn't work out. But it is just interesting to think about what could have happened if they had hung around a little bit longer.
Absolutely.
Into the 80s, and basketball got hot, and then you had in the 90s with Air Jordan, and it really got big. So it's possible that in the future it could happen again, but it's just one of those missed opportunities that I think basketball fans in the area still, that remember it, kind of still lament it.
And that's one thing too. I think that not only Buffalo, but even Rochester, they get a bad rap for some reason when it comes to professional, being able to house and have successful professional sports franchises. Like everybody, like you said, people think about Buffalo, they think about the 4 Super Bowls or Scott Norwood, or how cold it is, or how, with the no goal, or the list goes on and on. But you think to yourself, Rochester's had a laundry list of successful sports franchises. Buffalo, the same exact thing. But for some reason, and then like you mentioned, with like Cleveland, for instance, I mean, I know Cleveland, I don't know the specific breakdowns of which city's bigger, which city's more successful, but obviously we've seen Buffalo, both I'm sure you have as much as I have, seen the revitalization of downtown Buffalo. And it's almost to the point now where with younger kids who are getting into basketball because of teams like Cleveland being so close, hey, I can take a 3-hour drive and go see whomever play, or hey, I can go across the border before COVID and go see the Raptors play. And I think that I don't have hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars to make this decision, but just looking at it and looking at the landscape, you think to yourself, it really seems like a no-brainer. Again, I know it's more difficult than that, but let me have this. It's a very much a no-brainer, I think.
That's true. And another thing that I always get irritated is sports people in the national media will say, well, Buffalo is a small market. They don't take into account that, the Bills fan base, for example, it's not just people in Buffalo, people in Rochester, Syracuse, Southern Ontario. You draw all those people to a game. And not just to a game, but to follow the team. And so I get irritated when people say, oh, it's a small market, because, it's sort of like they say that about the Green Bay Packers, and yet everyone in Milwaukee follows the Packers, because that's the only football team in Wisconsin. Well, the Bills are the only football team in New York State. The Giants and the Jets both play in New Jersey. So, and in fact, if you don't get till maybe Albany before the Bills fan base sort of starts to peter out. And so we do have a large fan base that's interested in not only football, but just in sports in general. So there's no reason why we couldn't have many more pro teams and other leagues coming here.
It really does seem like that if you build it, they will come mantra. I mean, we've seen when the Sabres were better. I mean, obviously now it's a little difficult because the Sabres have not been good for a very long period of time. But you'll get those fans that roll in on a Wednesday, Thursday night from Southern Ontario, or when the Leafs play, fans travel well, or you get people from Montreal, they all travel well. Everybody loves to come to the area, and the fans are all over the place. I mean, we know mostly because of the 90s Bills, a lot of people like my parents, obviously because we're in the area, but you look around and you see people. I ask my parents, why are so many people Bills fans? And as I've gotten older, you kind of realize that it's like kind of like once you're here, you're family, really. And they all like the Bills because the Bills were the hot thing back in the 90s. And then they raised their kids to be Bills fans. And now that the Bills are good again, I think it's all going to grow exponentially, which kind of it creates that, like you said, there's that small market feel because they play in Orchard Park. Because, you could walk to someone's house from the stadium. Like, okay, great. That doesn't mean that they're not a big market team or a bigger market team, because obviously they're not playing in downtown Los Angeles or I guess in Jerry's world or whatever. But the Bills fan base is pretty big. The Sabres fan base, even though they haven't been great, I still like to think it's pretty big. And again, if they had basketball or MLS or baseball, like you mentioned in your book, it could be bigger. I mean, I think there's no doubt about that. But the last question I wanted to ask you today before we wrapped up the interview here, you have 10 topics in your book. Without kind of giving them away, because I want to leave the readers, I want to let them have the ability to check them out for themselves. I want to break down one of them. And I want to ask you, which one of these 10 topics was your favorite, not only to research, but to write about, to kind of do the what-ifism? Which one was your favorite of the 10?
That's a little bit of a difficult question to answer. I could say that, I suppose, I think the first one maybe was one of the favorites. What if Terry and Kim Pegula didn't buy the Buffalo Bills? Just because, just the research of how so many other football teams have left. If you look at, San Diego and St. Louis and, Oakland losing their football franchises, that just seemed like a real heartbreak, and a real miracle that the team managed to stay in town. So, I actually covered that topic before because I actually wrote a book, 5 years ago called We All Just Bought a Team was a recent one, but, it was called Not Just Snow and Chicken Wings, which was about local interest stuff, but it was sports and other things like historic preservation, where I covered the story from my point of view. And then for this one, I asked a different group of different sports writers what they thought about it, and I got some different answers than what I normally would have covered. So I guess I could say one of those was probably my favorite topic, and that's with football. I guess with the Sabres, some of the, just the history of the team. I mean, the tank with Jack Eichel I thought was really interesting because there was a parallel in the 1980s where the Pittsburgh Penguins had tanked to draft Mario Lemieux and actually admitted to it. I mean, the coach Lou Langotti and the GM Eddie Johnson actually said we went out and we actually did go tank to draft Lemieux, and they got a lot of flack for it, but they ended up winning a Stanley Cup, more than one actually. And so, taking to draft a good player, I don't think there was, problem. I know some sports writers in town thought it was outrageous and it was wrong, but I guess for hockey, that would be one of my favorites. And there's 10 chapters, so those are just a couple.
Yep.
But I mean, there's other things. How Jim Kelly went to the Houston Gamblers for 3 years at the USFL and then came back to the Bills. Didn't want to sign here, how that would have been different. So there's just a lot of different topics in there. I couldn't say that I have one favorite, but probably a couple of them would be, what would happen if the Bills had left town, if the Pegulas hadn't bought them, or the Sabres hadn't tanked for Eichel, but there's a lot of other different what ifs in there. Absolutely. Gilbert Perreault could have gone to the Vancouver Canucks if that spin of the wheel hadn't happened, and some older people probably remember that one. That was before my time, but just a lot of what ifs that would have, they haven't all been bad endings, as it were. Some of them have, but you look at the Pegulas buying both teams with a good ending. So not all of our sports outcomes have been bad, as it turns out.
Thankfully, they all haven't been bad, and a lot more recently have been good than bad, which is also fantastic. So, Jeff, before I let you go, let the people know how they can reach out to you if they want to talk to you about the book, talk about sports, or just talk about writing or whatever. How can they reach out to you?
Well, I have an Amazon author page. I don't know if people can contact me that way. I suppose they could probably contact me through. I don't want to give out personal details, but
Oh, sure.
I have a LinkedIn page. They can always send a hello that way.
That would be perfect.
I think I have a published, well, I guess Amazon Author Central. I think there may be a way. I'm just new to it, so there may be a way to contact me for there. Or if any of your fans want to get in touch, you have my info that you can always refer them to me through yourself.
Absolutely.
That's also the way to do it.
Well, Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time today. Again, you can check it out, Amazon.com. We all just bought a team, the biggest what-ifs in Buffalo sports history. Thanks again for joining me, and have a great night. We'll look forward to chatting with you soon.
All right, Ryan. Well, thanks for having me on your show.
Absolutely.
The preceding presentation has been brought to you by the Gear Network.